Hi, everyone. This is Jay Conforti, and I'm listening to the Payroll Podcast.
Welcome to the Payroll Podcast with your host, Nick Day of JGA Recruitment, specialist payroll recruiters.
Hello and welcome to the Payroll Podcast. Today I am delighted to be joined by Jay Conforti, Director of HR Transformation at KPMG in KPMG's Chicago office, so another podcast from across the water. He boasts over 15 years experience in HR and payroll, and currently he is helping organizations transform global HR and payroll operations through target operating model strategy, operations efficiency, organizational design, technology, and outsourcing, and has successfully led 3 of the largest global HR and payroll shared services transformations performed over the past 5 years. Prior to joining KPMG, Jay was a senior manager supporting global HR and payroll service delivery, operational teams both onshore and offshore for a financial services company, along with having prior experience in the HR outsourcing business area at a global consulting organization. Now, Jay is a seasoned HR practitioner. He is experienced in consulting with clients on current trends, strategic insights, service offerings, and more, as provided by various external HR and payroll outsource vendors, along with assisting with process excellence, optimization, analytics, and quality opportunities within their various HR functions. So a huge wealth of expertise that I plan to delve into today on the Payroll Podcast. Without further ado, I'd like to go straight to it. I would like to welcome Jay to the Payroll Podcast. Hey, Jay, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for letting me join today. Excited to be here.
5 quick questions.
Can you give the listeners a little bit of an insight into your career journey to date to, I guess, just give them some indication of how you traveled through your journey to becoming Director of HR Transformation at KPMG?
Sure, absolutely. So, interestingly enough, I get this question asked a lot, and I think my answer always has been not exactly sure how I got here. It's not one of those things I think I planned to do. But as I look back over kind of my career, I started off very early on. Doing my undergraduate studies both in finance and international business.
Sure.
And where that landed initially was working for an organization. I was an internal auditor that was auditing employee expense reports and making sure that they were taxed correctly from a U.S. perspective. And I think early on in my career, I was like, man, I just don't know if this is something that I can see myself doing long term. And so as time went on, I kind of took a leap of faith, and I was actually working in a payroll operations area as a payroll processor. And I remember thinking at that time and telling my manager, man, I just don't think I'm going to be, a payroll person the rest of my life. And she kind of laughed and she's like, well, I want to have this conversation with you, let's say 10 years down the road. And I said, okay. And, as a result of that, I started to really learn more about, not only how payroll was done domestically, but then also starting globally. And as time went on in that organization, I started to learn kind of the upstream and downstream impacts of other areas, that play such a critical role in getting to the point of processing payroll. So really, looking at the HR function. And as a result of that, I had gotten to a point in my career where, I felt it would really be beneficial to actually work in an HR and or payroll group and industry. And so I left consulting initially, and I ended up working in an HR and payroll operations area for a large financial services organization, which really gave me the opportunity to really learn more broadly about not only payroll, but really how HR functions from an end-to-end perspective.
Obviously, since you started in payroll, it's a career that you fell into, as many people do. How have you seen the role of the payroll of HR professional change since you first started in payroll?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Nick. So I feel like, I'm seeing this and I'm hearing this more and more with clients is that really the role of the payroll professional, it's really continuing to evolve over time. And it's the type of role that's moving away from kind of the old mindset that it's just kind of a data entry, where you're really focusing on just processing various transactions, but really now becoming more of a strategic partner, working with various parts of an organization's business areas, example like finance, HR, IT. But I also think, the role of the payroll professional is really requiring, a different type of skill set, just outside of, being able to process transactions. It's giving that individual an opportunity to really hone in on, technology experience, being more global in nature, having that individual have an opportunity to be more analytical, being able to really drive and produce data and analytics, but also having an opportunity to work with external payroll providers as well.
Sure, and that's certainly something we're seeing this end as well, certainly over in the UK. And I think a lot of it's to do with all of the emerging trends, going to things like robotic process automation, which frees up the time for a lot of payroll professionals to spend on then strategic tasks as a result. So, but from your perspective, what are the kind of emerging trends in global payroll and HR that are demanding your attention right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'll start with HR first, because HR right now there's such I want to call it like a disruption, in a lot of organizations, and so there's really kind of I call it like my top 7 that come to mind. So first and foremost, HR, there's purpose and culture within HR that's really changing, around what is the purpose of where our organization is going from an HR perspective. What's the type of culture we want to drive internally as organizations are becoming more global in nature. Workforce shaping is really important. So there is a drive and a need to attract and retain top talent within HR organizations. So how do we, go about doing that? As we think about who we have today, but really, thinking ahead in the future with a focus on succession planning is really on the minds of a lot of HR professionals. Workforce insights and analytics, again, is being really big as we drive to tell the story across all functions in HR. Like, what does that really look like? But really being able to actually get that data, within your HCM system is really important. If I shift gears, enabling technology, I would say right now is probably the hottest trend in HR. So organizations are, moving off of the old kind of on-premise technology solutions, and they're, looking to move to the cloud. But as part of that, there's so many cloud solutions that are out there. So, organizations are now, going through the exercise to think about, well, what is the right fit for me? Is that a Workday per se, or is it an Oracle, or maybe it's, SAP Success Factors. So, technology is big. HR organization of the future is an interesting one. So, the roles of the HR professionals are changing, and there's roles that are starting to formulate in HR organizations that, folks haven't seen before. And it's interesting, and I'll go through just a couple of these just to kind of give you a flavor. One of these is around things that are being focused around, workforce experienced consultants that are sitting in HR. And these are individuals that are thinking about, they're experts that are designing the thinking to, ensuring a great experience for HR and for employees. Another interesting one is robotics capability managers. So as organizations are thinking about, IA and how that could potentially work in an HR organization, there are roles that are tailoring around that.
We're seeing a lot of that on the payroll side as well. I think it's with the influx of data and robotics and the titles changing with more sort of payroll and analysts needed and similar. So we're seeing, seems like it's hitting both industries equally.
It is, and again, that's just a couple examples. And I think just the other, the big thing that comes up a lot, within HR and unfortunately sometimes tends to be overlooked, but it's something that I think is really important and crucial is, the change management and the leadership, right? Because with all of the changes and the disruptors that are happening both externally and internally, how do you prepare for that? So meaning like, what are the impacts that are happening to HR professionals and employees? What are, the communication types of things that need to happen internally? And then, from a training perspective, right? I mean, do we have to go back and, start to retrain our HR professionals and different things? So those are some of the big ones on the HR side. So from a global payroll perspective, I would say, what are my top 3 emerging trends? One, I would say, is building kind of that global payroll function of the future. And how do you do that? First and foremost, and I think it's really important, is making sure that you've got a strategy in place. And folks sometimes tend to think, well, strategy, I mean, that's like, that's so broad. Like, what does that mean? To me, that's really making sure that you have kind of the right service delivery model in place. So thinking about, what are those things that, you truly want to continue to do internally from a processing perspective, but what are those things that, make sense that maybe an outsourced provider could do? It's very, very important. Compliance is probably my number 2, because again, as Nick, and for I'm sure our listeners, payroll is one of the highest risk areas in any organization, whether it sits in HR, whether it sits in finance. So making sure that you're compliant, and especially even now, with us kind of getting ready to hit that 1-year mark around GDPR, I mean, it's just crucial, that organizations continue, to look at that from a perspective. And probably the other third emerging trend, and I think I mentioned this on the HR side, is around cloud technology, for payroll. Like, what does that mean in the future? So, moving to not only kind of a potential cloud-based technology, but what are some of the other features, that employees, and individuals want to see now? One of those is mobile capability, right? Being able to look at my paycheck on my phone, or if I need to, transfer funds around. Right now, I can do it with a, one click, and, I go on with my day. So I could probably go on, but, those are kind of the 3 big things, that, are on everyone's minds.
Well, I love the fact you brought up the mobile side. I remember not that long ago when my mobile phone would only hold 12 messages and I had to delete one to allow another one to come in. And we've advanced so fast. And, with technology advancing as quickly as it is, and you mentioned globalization there, the globalization of businesses is becoming more possible every day. With that in mind, what kind of, have you seen strategies change in relation to sort of technology advancing at the speed that it is, or attitudes towards global payroll and HR operations changed as a result?
So I think where the change is happening more and more, Nick, is that from a technology perspective, organizations, a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, they're on this journey to kind of pick that cloud-based technology. And then once it's chosen, they're slamming that technology in. And they think that that's going to solve the issues, that they've seen in the past. And what happens, when that occurs, is we find that organizations haven't, as part of that technology deployment, started to look at the strategy around that technology. So making sure that the service delivery model fits with the technology. making sure that processes are truly designed end to end, right, with that global mindset, but also, taking into account any of those local regulatory requirements. And I hate to say this, but what happens is that when that exercise doesn't occur, organizations have to go back and almost retransform themselves once that technology is done. So to your question, we're seeing organizations really look at that picture holistically now. So not only is they're looking at technology, they're looking at the service delivery model, they're looking at, people. So they're really doing this more hand in hand so that at the end of the day, everything can work in tandem and, they have an effective, whether it is an HR operations or whether it's a global payroll that, operations, that really everything works hand in hand with each other.
And obviously it's your responsibility as your role of Director of HR Transformation at KPMG, I guess, to advise and help clients on their journey towards achieving that more holistic outcome, is the way that you put it. And I know that you've obviously led, and I mentioned in my introduction, 3 of the largest global HR payroll shared service transformations performed over the past 5 years. And your teams are helping develop future state HR and payroll strategies for multiple clients. And I know that that's included things like target operating models, organizational design, and many other things as well. What's been your most memorable project? And maybe it's something you're working on now, or maybe it's something that started from one place and you really managed to transform it. But is there one that particularly sticks in your mind?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I think every project I've been on, has a different, memory that comes to mind. But so the one I would say engagement that comes to my mind. So this is a project that we did about 5 or 6 years ago. We took one of the largest global pharmaceutical companies in the world that had a model where everything was outsourced, both from a payroll and HR perspective. And that organization made a decision as a result of some compliance issues that ended up morphing even more. They made the decision to bring it all back in-house. Big project, and it was a large endeavor. And the way that we helped this organization transform is we had to work with their provider at the time, really to gain all of these, documents initially, right? Because to understand kind of that current state. We then helped the client focus on rebuilding each of those HR functions and payroll into that new captive model. So meaning that there would be folks internally that would run all of these processes in a global shared services type of organization. We helped them redesign all of those processes. So meaning that we spent time doing Visio flows, writing standard operating procedures for all of these processes. We helped them. We worked in tandem with another provider who was the SI to build an SAP cloud-based solution for HR and payroll. And then as part of that, we helped design what that organization was going to look like for HR and payroll globally. We helped almost retrain individuals. And, part of the one memory that comes to mind is as we also helped them kind of set up that contact center, the day that we physically went live and we flipped the switch where the technology turned on, the contact center turned on, we started taking calls live. I remember walking in that contact center, running around with flags, phone calls are coming in. That to me was probably one of the most memorable things that I think about, because myself, and there was probably at the time about 50 KPMG people there, and seeing, being part of that from the onset, where this organization really didn't have this captive solution. So helping them design it, build it, implement it, and then to see it go live.
Must have been amazing.
It was it just kind of goes without words. So it's really a truly great story to tell.
Especially when you physically witness the blood, sweat, and tears that's gone into making all that happen. I mean, that's fantastic. I know that some of the feedback we get from consultants that we place on the recruitment side is, sometimes they want a permanent position because they often are just consulting and they solve problems but never see the solution actually happen or the solution go through because that's the end of their project. So the fact you had an opportunity to witness it, I think must have been quite incredible.
Yeah, and Nick, and you're right in that regard, because I think a lot of times too, I think myself included and other consultants will tell you is that, a lot of times if we're there at the onset to kind of do that strategy, but then, sometimes the organization may go with another, provider, or they may, not move forward, with the strategy that you propose. A lot of times you kind of get to that point and you don't move forward. But, when you have an opportunity to be there from the onset and to really see and be part of a full-blown transformation from start to finish is truly a unique and rewarding experience for anyone.
Now, I read in my research to this podcast that actually there was it may have been the same project. In fact, it might well be because I read that you previously reviewed and analysed over 15,000 global HR, payroll, technical and process documents that were created during one of your clients' transitions to SAP from their previous outsourced provider. Was that the same project? Was that a different project?
It is, yes.
Same one.
Mm-hmm.
So, slightly different question then. With something of that size and that stature, what's your roadmap process for scaling and preparing for such a project? Like, where do you start?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it takes time, and a lot of that work initially you start to design and you articulate as part of the strategy, because before you can go into your design and build, you have to have a clear understanding of kind of what the current state is. Where the organization wants to go in the future. And one of the other interesting things I always tell clients too is, you have to kind of set some guardrails or almost guiding principles that you're going to follow throughout the transformation. And once you kind of get through that strategy, you start to build out, from a roadmap perspective, okay, so what are the things that I know I'm going to need to design initially, right? And that could be processes. It could be designing new roles and responsibilities, right, that the organization might not have. Designing a governance framework, and that can be around making sure you've got the right operational controls, segregation of duties. So you kind of time box out, based off of how big the organization is, when they want to go live per se. And then that's kind of the trickle down effect, because then you get into your build phase, and that's where folks are kind of heads down. You're building out your standard operating procedures, you're building out training materials. It's all getting you prepared and ready for that, that go live date. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. And I think the biggest thing as well is you have to have that executive buy-in and sponsorship throughout the entire transformation, because if you don't, that's where challenges occur, primarily around being able to kind of meet that go live date, but also the key and critical decisions that happen along the way.
Sure. I mean, it's a huge amount of responsibility on your shoulders. I guess that's what comes with getting to the top of HR transformation. But I imagine, I wouldn't even want to try and imagine the kind of budgets involved for a project of that size. But when you are faced with those kind of projects, what are the biggest challenges then? If you've talked about there's all the different things you need to roadmap in order to prepare for such a project, but there's obviously you touched upon some elements there in terms of designing, building, and implementing sort of new global shared services solutions for global clients. When you do that, what are typically the biggest challenges you're faced with?
Yeah, that's a good question, Nick. So one of them I feel like I hear a lot is being able to change the mindset of how things have always been, right? Because as you go into discussions and you're, as an example, you're designing processes, clients always say, well, this is the way we've always done it. Well, we can't change it. And that's okay. We're prepared for that. But, let's talk about, why. Why can't, you, again, as an example, move away from a manual process and leverage automation more, and maybe there's just a reason you just can't do it, right? But let's talk through that. So I would say that the mindset to change is a big challenge. I think a lot of organizations, I think, sometimes struggle with. The other, I think, is making sure, as these projects are global, that you're taking into account cultural differences. So a lot of times, when we're working with clients, they want to just kind of design and build things really just from that US perspective. But when it is a global project and you've got other countries involved, you have to take additional time to do some of those, localizations, right? And making sure that we're caring for, certain nuances that are country specific. And that's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard for folks in those countries that maybe haven't done this type of work before, working closely with them. Language barrier can be difficult. The time change, right? A lot of times, you're working more on, if I think about like if you're working with like Asia Pacific clients, well, for us in the US, those are late nights, right? And so being able to, adjust and adapt to that, can be a challenge. But I think really then the other biggest one is that, you go live with these projects. And a lot of times from a consultant perspective, clients tend to think, well, the consultants are done and, they're gone and, we have to figure this out now, right? Because we don't have those resources, that can help us. And so, I find with us, and I know my colleagues will stay the same, is that we don't go in with that mindset. We work with clients, as long as they need us and want us to be there. I think that's ensures that not only a successful transformation occurs, but it also ensures that, organizations that come out of these transformations are going to continue to stabilize over time. It's not something that happens overnight. And they need to know that they're going to have that continued support, until they feel comfortable that they can kind of stand on their own.
Sure. And I think in the first part of your answer there, you mentioned, the change management piece is, changing people's mindsets, one of the most complex things. I guess that's ties back to where that executive buy-in is so important. If you've got the buy-in at executive level, it makes it easier for you to deliver that change. And on point two, you talked about the country-specific nuances. Is there a particular country that causes you more, or regions that cause you more challenges than others, or?
That's a good question. I would say, is there a country that causes more? In the past, if you would have asked me this a couple of years ago, I probably would have said Asia Pac. Now, with so many changes, specifically in EMEA, as it pertains to GDPR, that's a challenge. I also think from a works council perspective, they play such a crucial and pivotal part in certain countries in EMEA. That tends to be challenging as well. So that's, I would say right now, it leans for me personally a little bit more in EMEA. But, I think you face, those challenges even domestically, right? There are some organizations based off of, their business, where there are those nuances you have to account for. But from a global perspective, I would say kind of EMEA would be my first.
Well, that probably ties in. We did a podcast recently where it was mentioned about there's a global payroll complexity survey undertaken. And I think there are some payrolls within EMEA that certainly ranked right towards the top of that survey. I think there are maybe in Italy and France were quite high scoring. as being quite difficult payrolls to be able to manage from a change perspective. But it's funny how things change. Well, look, we're going to find out a little bit more about you, Jay, if we can. And then we're going to jump back into some more questions about some of the challenges that you think are facing payroll and HR teams right now.
So just a quick break to say, if you haven't heard the latest song yet, My Payroll Career, it's all about payroll. Here's a quick snippet, available now on iTunes or Amazon Play. Enjoy.
You see, I love payroll, and payroll loves me. I don't mind liaising with HMRC. I love manual payments and calculating S&P. Yeah, payroll is the career for me.
That was My Payroll Career, available now in iTunes and Amazon Play. Right, back to the podcast.
Time to find out more about you.
I wondered if you could tell us how your friends or your work colleagues would describe you.
Oh boy, that's a tough question. So how would my friends describe me? I feel like if I think about kind of my life, a lot of my friends are near and dear to my heart. I have a range of folks that, that I'm still very close with that, I think back to grade school, friends that I still have from high school, from college. They would probably describe me as an individual that kind of wears my heart on my sleeve. I think I take, all of the times that we've had, good times, bad times, I cherish those, and those are memories that I will always have. And I also think, with all of our lives being as busy as they are, mine included, that, it's sometimes taking that step back and just being able to make time for each other, whether it's just getting together, having a cup of coffee, getting together at someone's house, letting all of our kids play together. It's just, being able to take a step back and, out of our busy lives and making time for each other, which is important.
Love that. And wholeheartedly agree. It's challenging sometimes to be able to do it, but when you do, it's great to reap the rewards. So can you tell us something about you that perhaps other people wouldn't know about you?
Oh boy, some fun facts about me. Unfortunately, and I will say it, I am a TV reality junkie.
Okay.
My wife and I both, when I'm not traveling, we watch a lot of reality TV. I would also say, definitely a big Chicago sports fan, big fan of the Chicago Cubs, the Chicago, the Bears. I will say a fun fact about me, and my wife would probably kill me because she hates when I say this story, but it's an interesting one. So I actually applied to be on The Bachelorette.
Okay.
Which is a big U.S. show.
I know it very well. I shouldn't probably admit this either, but I think my wife has seen every single series.
Yep.
She is addicted, absolutely addicted, my wife.
So I applied and was a contestant back several seasons ago.
So you didn't just apply, you got onto the show.
I got on, and then so there was 3 of us from Chicago that got chosen.
Oh, wow.
And I was cut at the last minute because they chose 2 other individuals, and the reason that was is I was actually in consulting, and due to the sensitivity, my employer at the time had said, you can go forward with this, but please know that you could potentially risk not having a role here. So I made it very far, and it was funny because I remember when the first episode aired, and the 2 gentlemen that I was with in Chicago were part of the first rose ceremony. One of them collapsed, and I remember watching it. And anyway, so long story short, that's kind of my one kind of TV claim to fame.
Oh, I love that. And as soon as this podcast's finished, I'm going to rush inside and tell my wife she'll love it. I don't think she's ever missed an episode of any series. It's the one reality thing that she's totally hooked to. So,
yeah.
there's The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, and there's 2 of them. And Yeah, I know it well.
Yes.
I know it's about you, but I'll mention it because it's relevant. My cousin was actually, I don't know if you're familiar with The Island with Bear Grylls.
Yes.
But
Oh, yeah.
my cousin was on the last series. He was a guy called Elliot. He was the chef in the UK series, the last series that ever aired. So,
Oh, get
not me
out.
personally, but my cousin was on there. Yeah,
Oh,
it's cool.
wow. Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's cool. So, while we're on the weird and wonderful, I've got a nice question for you. You're abducted by aliens who want to learn more about our species. What item would you take with you?
I honestly would probably the one item I would take. So myself, my wife, and two boys, we do a family picture in the fall every year, and I would probably take one of those. I would take a family portrait with me.
What game or instrument would you teach them?
That's interesting. So the instrument or game I would probably is I'm going to kind of go back, several years. I'll probably date myself, but in my office here, I actually have a calculator that I used to use when I was calculating, as I mentioned earlier, employee expense reports, and I had to total up things. So I would probably show them how to use my little Texas Instrument calculator.
Love that. Love that. That's a sign of a true payroll professional right there. Someone who used to use a calculator and mental arithmetic and everything else to calculate manual pay. Love it. What would you tell them about humans?
I would probably say that there's such a mix of individuals around the world, from a culture perspective, and, there's just so much diversity, in all of us.
And what truth or human trait would you hold back?
What would I hold back? Probably that sometimes I feel like we can be a little too judgmental, and not sometimes always understanding the full picture or facts about something. So that's what I would probably hold back.
Right. I love that answer. Actually, in recruitment, that's something that we've got to train our staff to be very much on the ball for, because you can make very quick judgments when looking at CVs, and actually there's a personality behind the paperwork, and it's important that we try to understand that, because a CV or a resume only tells half the story.
Yeah, exactly.
The individual paints the rest of the picture. So I love that response. Fantastic. Well, let's dive back in. I know that the listeners are going to be really keen to hear about how you see the future of the payroll and HR industry. So if we start with that question, what do you believe are the biggest challenges facing payroll and HR teams right now?
So, there's a couple of those, Nick. So one is that I feel like, we talked a little bit about compliance before. I think as, global payroll organizations are trying to figure out, as I mentioned earlier, really around kind of what is that true global payroll strategy that's going to make sense for the organization. It's hard, right? And part of that strategy is, we talked a little bit before, determining, where should the work sit in the future. So, what are the types of, global payroll activities, should an organization potentially retain, what are some of those things that, maybe an outsourced provider should do? In that same vein, what is the right global payroll solution? I think the question that I hear a lot is, is there really one true global payroll solution? Is there one truly global provider that can do it all? So being able to be familiar with who are the players in the market, whether they're, the big niche players, and then you have, some of the smaller vendors that are, slowly rising. It's really kind of who are those vendors that are going to be a cultural fit for the organization. I think the other challenge is that organizations that do leveraged outsourced models and that have been in those models for a long time and maybe have been in contracts for a long time, taking the opportunity to kind of step back and really looking at those contracts to make sure that, the services are really being adhered to by the provider. Are organizations kind of really getting the biggest bang for their buck, because they're paying large, expenditures, right, when you outsource. So looking at that, making sure that, providers are really meeting and adhering to, the service level agreements.
Do you think suppliers sometimes get complacent if they've had a long-term contract?
Yeah.
From a executive board level, if the payroll's working and people are getting paid on time, they may not think to really analyze the SLA too deeply. They're thinking everyone's being paid, there's no issue there.
Yeah,
Do you think people get complacent?
Yeah, Nick, I think that's a great question. And I do think it happens. And I think it's on no fault of an organization. But I think what happens is that when you get into that type of model and you've been in it for a while, I think the mindset is, well, the provider is doing all this for us. Like, we don't really need to worry about it, And I think, when you're in that mindset and then let's say something happens, right? So maybe it's a late payment or maybe it's a payroll that's missed. That kind of like it triggers, something in the organization to think about, okay, wow, so we haven't really looked or thought about this. Maybe we need to take a step back and really kind of see if this, is really effectively working. So I feel like it's, as I mentioned, like it's things that kind of go, I don't want to say stagnant, but things just kind of, are business as usual for a long time. And it's that one event that happens that triggers, an organization to really kind of rethink about that. So
I think we have it here in recruitment. I mean, I've worked with some clients for nearly 20 years, but sometimes you've worked with people for so long, you just kind of assume that if they've got a vacancy or requirement that they'll pick up the phone to me. And actually, I can sometimes get complacent as a result. I think, hey, we've known each other for 20 years. Of course they'll call. But actually, there's more to it than that. I'm not releasing content through podcasts or relevant articles and keeping in their mind's eye and showing that we're staying up to date. Then there's every chance they'll go somewhere else. So, I think it's a challenge we face in recruitment. And I think it's, as you want, albeit maybe smaller scale, I can totally understand why, through no fault of their own as a supplier, you can get complacent if you've been with a business for a long time and it's working. But they may well have new technologies or new innovations or new things they could actually deliver to improve that service that maybe they haven't offered yet.
Yep.
On the Payroll Podcast here, something we're often championing is, and you've mentioned it already in the first part of the podcast, is championing payroll as a strategic function. In the UK, there's a lot of payroll professionals that believe that payroll shouldn't sit under finance or HR. It's got to the point now where it can stand alone as its own function, not reliant on either or the other. And we personally believe on the podcast, it's probably only going to become more strategic as a profession with the implementation of new robotic process automation processes, because it should free up time for payroll professionals that hopefully they can spend on a more strategic related task. I think that's something you mentioned earlier with some of the HR titles you're seeing with robotic leaders and robotic managers coming into play. But with this in mind, how do you see the role of the strategic payroll professional changing in relation to those sister functions such as HR and finance?
Yeah, it's a good question, Nick. And I think, where organizations are starting, and you mentioned this as well around, can payroll be a standalone area? It's interesting. I haven't seen a lot of organizations move to that type of concept yet. Not to say that it couldn't happen. I do see, though, as organizations are looking at the global payroll function, where should it reside in the future? I would say if you asked me this question a couple of years ago, kind of where the split is, it was leaning more where it was sitting in the finance arena. I think now that mindset is starting to shift a bit because there are so many dependencies, right? As I mentioned earlier, of salary components and other variables, that get to the point to get to payroll, and a lot of that resides in HR. So I think organizations are starting to think about more kind of, does that, first and foremost, does that function, could that sit in HR? It absolutely could. It could sit in finance as well. But if it moves into the HR arena, the role of the payroll professional, again, it aligns a lot with even HR professionals, and meaning that we're trying to make more roles very strategic in nature. And not to say that there won't always be a transactional component in that payroll type of role, and even in HR, but it's making that role, I would say, more strategic, partnering with the business, giving folks the opportunity to grow in their profession, being able to give them more of that global type of opportunity. And specifically, I've seen this so much in the US where these roles were always tailored to be so domestic focused. With organizations becoming more global, the payroll professional is not just supporting, a US based population. They could be supporting Latin America, as well. They could be supporting Canada. Some organizations, they may be supporting some countries in EMEA. So, that role, again, being able to give folks that global opportunity also means there's a mindset, some retraining opportunities, because these individuals, may not be necessarily as familiar with specific kind of payroll regulation and laws in countries. So it's, that role is changing in that front. And also from an automation perspective. And I think from payroll, I think there's still a lot to be determined there. But as organizations are looking to automate more and to use bots per se, that's going to change the role of the payroll professional as well.
Just how much it's changed in just 2 years. You said 2 years ago to look different. It's amazing how much it's progressed in such a short time frame.
Yeah, and so part of that is just it's having providing more educational opportunities. I think the area of automation, I think it scares people because I think there's the mindset, well, is a bot going to take away my job? And that is not necessarily the case. It's bots are there. I have seen them used a little bit in payroll for certain things, not everything. So that's going to change the role of the payroll professional as well. And I also just think, to end on this topic, is making sure that role can be multifunctional as well. So maybe that role is, if there's some bandwidth, maybe they are kind of helping, with some other, HR processes, or maybe it is helping out with, some finance processes. So making that role even multifunctional, I think we'll see that change in the future.
Great. Totally agree. And actually that touches upon some of the concepts mentioned in the last podcast I recorded with Amber from Reward Strategy magazine, but she sees, the role of the payroll professional becoming a lot more hybrid in the future. But look, we're going to go to a quick advert break, but stay with us. I'm really excited. The next lot of questions are going to be with Jay. He's going to give us some key advice on various things in terms of how you can develop your payroll, how you can pick vendors and so on. So I'm going to go to a quick advert and we'll jump straight back.
Einstein famously said that insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We believe it's time to try a new approach to recruitment. JGA Recruitment specialise in recruiting the top 15% of payroll and HR talent using innovative 24/7 attraction strategies that are proven to improve quality of hire, candidate retention and return on investment. De-risk your recruitment process today and hire better talent faster with JGA Recruitment. Visit jgarecruitment.com to find out more. 5 technical questions.
First question is, what advice would you give a company planning to move from a domestic to a global payroll? And what are the key things you would suggest they need to consider before embarking on such a project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the first thing that I think about, when I worked in HR and payroll years ago, and I tell this to clients a lot, is I feel like the first thing is to think about and gaining a clear understanding of what is kind of the current state of the state. And that's really looking at, spending some time having conversations, with those key payroll folks outside of the U.S. to understand, operationally, how are things done today, right? So it's understanding, how processes are done, understanding, are there any kind of current challenges that that they're facing limitations. That's the first part. So really kind of getting a good sense of the state of the state. The second thing I always I think about, and we've touched, on this topic, is is understanding, what do you want that future state target operating model to look like, right? And we've talked a lot about that, thus far around kind of where does the work sit, who's going to do the work. But one of the other components around that strategy is, what does that potential financial and opportunity case look like? And what that means is going through an exercise to kind of understand, what are the total operating costs today? So for doing payroll in all of these countries, what is the costs involved from a labor arbitrage perspective? If we are potentially, leveraging the same vendor, or maybe we're going to go out, for an RFP, understanding what are the costs that are going to be involved for those vendors. So to potentially do an implementation. Technology-wise, if there's a technology component, are there going to be costs associated with that? Are there going to be licensing fees? And so holistically, coming out of that exercise is you've got kind of what is that total cost of ownership going to look like if I move to a global payroll? And is it going to be cost advantageous? And it might not be. Or is there a potential savings, as a light at the end of the tunnel, and how many years per se is it going to take the organization to get there? So that's very, very important. And I know it's a hard exercise to go through, whether an organization does that internally or they leverage a third party to help them. That story needs to be told, because I always say someone at the executive level is going to ask that question. And so you need to be prepared to speak to that.
Fantastic advice. What are the sort of essential practices or strategic choices you'd recommend clients put in place to manage, and you mentioned this earlier in payroll, one thing that's really important at the moment, managing risk and compliance?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Nick. So, a couple of things that come to mind is, one is making sure that you have the right controls in place on all of your processes, primarily just from an operational perspective. And that's just making sure that, the sign-offs are happening accordingly, making sure, there is an appropriate segregation of duties. So meaning that if I'm processing a payroll transaction, that I'm not going ahead and approving my own work. That's very, very important. I think the other thing is, making sure that you have almost like, and I hate to use this term, but it's kind of having that matrix of all of your roles within the organization, and really understanding the clear delineation of, okay, what does a global payroll do versus, a payroll manager, or maybe it's one of my payroll specialists. It's almost like a RACI kind of chart where you're saying, okay, here's what this role is responsible for. Here's what they're accountable for. Are they consulted? Are they informed? Very, very, important. Those are just a couple, I think, of the key things to really have in place from a risk and compliance perspective.
Yeah, no, they make perfect sense. No, great response. So it makes sense for me to ask you a question, having such an what's the word I'm looking for? An experienced consulting expert on the podcast. It makes sense for me to ask you, what are the considerations you think a company should consider, or indeed ask, to determine if there is a good fit with a prospective vendor?
That's a really good question. And I feel like there are, it's not easy, as you are thinking about moving to a new vendor. A couple things that come to my mind. First and foremost, are there going to be capabilities that the vendor will be able to do to meet the business requirements, of the organization from a payroll perspective. Because depending on, the size, the scope, if there's complexity, it's making sure that it's important. I think it's also, being able to ask the right questions around what is, the transition capability and approach that the vendor is going to take with that organization, right, as part of, that transformation. Looking at, where does the vendor have physical presence in required markets and capabilities? So, do they have local presence? Do they not? Technology is a big one, right? So being able to kind of see, what do they have? We talked a little bit about cloud-based solutions. What are the mobile capability is very important. The big one, obviously, pricing, because at the end of the day, right, it's, is it an apples to apples comparison of one vendor versus the other? But the last one, which I think is truly, truly important, is the vendor going to truly provide an overall and positive employee experience and customer satisfaction, for the organization? Because truly at the end of the day, and I think, Nick, this, and for folks, on the podcast, it's being able to pay people timely, accurately, compliantly, but just making sure at the same time that they're getting, the level of, employee experience and customer satisfaction every day.
Yeah, love that. And actually, it resonates with an article I posted out earlier this week. You may have seen it, talking about sometimes be wary of the invested, slick sales teams that can, that will push their wares. It's not to say that the solutions they're representing aren't brilliant solutions, but sometimes you can get slightly wooed by a very polished sales outfit that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to give you the best solution, because whilst they might be really good at the sales end of the spectrum, it's the service behind the sale that's really important.
Well, Nick, that brings up a good point too. When the vendors are meeting with clients, right? One of the questions that I always tell clients to ask is, are the folks in the room for that presentation, are these the folks, or is there a couple folks in the room? Is this the team that I'm going to be partnering with, to deliver payroll services? And if there's hesitancy, and, to your point, the folks from the sales side, they always come, and that's their role to do that. But, it's being able to show the cultural fit of what that team is going to be is so important. And we see this from a consultant perspective, even when we do pursuits with our clients, the work is important, right? And the price point is important. But for me, I always want clients to see who our true KPMG team is going to be, that's going to be working shoulder to shoulder with you, regardless of what the engagement is. And are we the right fit for you, and vice versa?
I love that. That's a great question. And I think for those listening, if you are considering a vendor change, or you're looking to move from a domestic to global payroll, rewind this part of the podcast, get a pen and paper, and take some really good notes. Some excellent questions and advice given there by Jay. And there's going to be a little bit more, so keep your pens at the ready. If I asked you, Jay, to provide 5 steps to achieving global payroll success, what would they be?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Nick. So here's my top 5: global payroll strategy, compliance, a governance structure, the right people, and third is really promoting that employee experience.
Fantastic. So, last question before we open the vault. What do you think are the most important qualities for effective leadership, and what is your personal leadership style?
It's interesting, because this is a question that I get asked a lot, and I truly feel that leadership is an area that it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that takes time, I think, within all of us to work towards and achieve. And I think for myself personally, and I think one of the original questions we didn't get to, but you had asked was, what would your your workers and your team say about you. I truly, I think leaders, and myself included, is to be able to take a very much hands-on approach. And it doesn't matter what the work is, but being able to roll up your sleeves and work with your teams. I think it's also important to empower your teams to not only be the doers, but be critical and be decision makers. That's how, we learn. Being able to promote an open door policy is so important. Folks should feel that they can come to you with concerns, to talk freely, openly. And I also think it's important, and I know it's sometimes hard to do, but get to know folks. A lot of times, we get so entrenched in the day-to-day work, and you lose sight of, we're all individuals. We all go home at night. We have families. We have pets. We have other things going on in our lives, and I think it's just taking the opportunity just to get to know folks is important. And the last thing that I'll just say is being able to push folks to a point where you want folks to do the best that they can do, but being able to provide them the opportunities to grow within their careers, but also thinking about the future, around, what does that mean from a succession planning for everyone?
Yeah, no, I love that. A lot of those qualities you've mentioned resonate with the kind of qualities that I believe in as well. And you're certainly the kind of leader I think that I would enjoy working for. So I think your views on leadership are very similar and mirror many of the things that I believe in. So really enjoyed that answer. Thanks, Jay. So look, we're going to open the vaults.
Entering the vault.
5 quick fire questions. I'm really sad to be almost at the end of this podcast. You've given us so much great content, so thank you ever so much. But very quickly, one piece of advice you would give to someone working in payroll or HR right now?
Always be looking towards the future. I find that sometimes a lot of folks in payroll, these are folks and it's a role that folks really truly gravitate towards, and they stay in those roles for a long amounts of times. I would say be open to change. Payroll, I feel like is just a stepping stone in your career. It can take you in so many different directions. And so I would just say, keep an open mind. And if you are interested, in other roles in your organization, whether that, potentially could be finance, whether it could be HR, your payroll experience and knowledge, you can bring that to any role that you choose to do in the future.
Fantastic. With the benefits of hindsight, what would be the one career decision you would change?
That's an interesting question. Probably personally, as I look, back to where I started, I would have liked to have done more HR and payroll work, maybe a little bit earlier on in my career. Coming out of university with a finance degree, you don't really kind of know directionally where you're going to go. And so for someone that was kind of put in a tax type of role, and I did that for, a few years in the initial onset, probably something that I would have done or thought about differently. But at the end of the day, I have no regrets. And I think, all paths have led me to where I am today.
That's always good to hear you haven't got regrets. That's the way we want to move forward with. So that's good news. If you had the power of foresight and could change the entire global payroll or HR industry with one action or improvement, what would that action or improvement be?
I would say honestly, Nick, and if this happens at some point, it'd be great, like a one-stop shop for global payroll, meaning that, whether, I think about kind of the external provider landscape, that there is, one truly global payroll solution that could work for everyone in, multiple countries around the world.
Well, I know they're all striving to be the first. There are many out there that that will want to be that first provider. So maybe we'll see that happen. Who motivates you and why?
There's a couple people, there have been managers that I have worked for in my previously in other organizations in KPMG that I have looked at as leaders throughout my career. And so I'm motivated, even though I don't necessarily work with those individuals on a daily basis. I still keep in contact with them. So I think, they motivate me. One of the great things about KPMG, outside of, the work that we do with clients is, I'm a performance management leader. And so I have counselees that I have had for several years, and to work with them, to mentor them, and to see them grow in their careers is truly, truly a rewarding experience for me. And the last, honestly, and just on a personal note, I owe a lot of my success to my wife and my kids. They being a consultant is not easy. There's a lot of fluctuation. A lot of change that happens in this type of role. But they have truly been there to support me, and I'm very fortunate for that.
Fantastic. It's great to hear that your family inspire you, and it's a common response. And it's great to hear so many people in the payroll and HR industry so close to such family-based people. I think everyone seems to be responding on how much their families and their networks have supported them. So that's great. If you didn't work in payroll or HR, what would you be doing?
So actually, I very early on in my career, back when I was in high school, I actually worked for Walmart for a little over 12 years. And I have always been fascinated with the retail industry. And so I've always said, even potentially when I retire, or I say that loosely, I would probably go back and work in retail again.
Okay, great. I thought it may have been something with acting and reality TV being an ageless phenomenon. And I thought maybe we'd see you in a future reality TV show.
I wish. No. I think that ship sailed years ago, but that's a great thought. Thank you, Nick, for thinking about me in that way.
No, it's my pleasure. Well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today, Jay. Thank you ever so much for joining us. You've given us so much content, so many critical pieces of advice that I think the listeners can go away and analyze and take notes about and use in whatever process or change management consideration that they're going through at the moment. So thank you ever so much for giving us so much intel that I think will really, really benefit our listeners. So it's been a fascinating, educational, and very enjoyable podcast. And I thank you ever so much for joining me today. I will put a link to your LinkedIn profile, just so for those listening are interested to find out more about yourself or KPMG. I'll put a link into the KPMG website as well. Which just leads me to say thank you so much for joining us and joining myself today on the Payroll Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to speaking to the listeners again in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Jay.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick.
You've been listening to the Payroll Podcast with Nick Day of JGA Recruitment, specialist payroll recruiters. If you would like to feature on a future podcast, please contact us. For a wealth of world-class payroll content, please visit us at jgarecruitment.com. See you next week.